Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Tevis-Finn recording from Franklin, and I'd like to give a shout out to Mr. Sperling who is tuned in tonight. Alright, so guys, we are getting into our next unit on imperialism and World War I. So we're beginning with this slide on American imperialism. For your guided notes, I want you guys to print them out and I want you to highlight as we go while you watch this screencast, and I want you to pay attention to any starred questions and please reflect. So guys, from the first slide, I put this American eagle. So I want you guys to note the wingspan. And the first thing I want you to think about and record is, what do you think the point of view is of American imperialism? So according to this cartoon, take a look at it, try to read what's below, and just give me your analysis. So let's move on to the second slide, guys. What do you think our foreign policy was, before we got into this imperialistic race of the 1900s? So pictured here is George Washington during his farewell address. And one of his quotes was to steer clear of permanent alliances. So this really held true for way over a century, and it really made us cautious of getting involved internationally. So our first foray is with Russia. And so our Secretary of State, William Seward, really sought to expand our territory, but the Civil War, stalled it. And so he purchased Alaska from Russia for $7 million. And he was ridiculed for this treaty. It was seen as worthless land. It was called an icebox, a couple other things from the time. It was known as Seward's Folly, the deal, because it cost us only 2 cents an acre. It was sometimes called Polar Bear Garden, so he was ridiculed. But gold and then oil was discovered in Alaska, so they became 2 huge sources of wealth for the U.S., and Seward was not seen as foolish anymore. Alright, so a question I have for you is, what is imperialism? We've certainly looked at it in your other history classes, and defined here, guys, as just an economic and political domination of a strong nation over a weaker one. And so what we see in our history, guys, is by the late 1800s, with our industry, we had increased trade and military presence in 2 areas, East Asia and Latin America. And even by the early 1900s, we had established an empire. And so another question I want you guys to reflect on your guided notes. Look at this. Uncle Sam saying, well, I hardly know which to take first. And so please check out the bill of fare, what he can choose on the menu. And I want you guys to respond, why do you think the U.S. focused on this area of the world in Latin America? And so Theodore Roosevelt takes on the role of international policeman next. So he does begin with Latin America, and he signs the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904. It's sometimes called the Big Stick Policy, which I have a great picture of in just a sec. But what it basically says is that the U.S. is supposed to take care of the Latin American nations, if they need economic or military assistance. So here is a great political cartoon of the international policeman now, Theodore Roosevelt. And so 2 places that especially need our help at this time were the Dominican Republic and Cuba. So in the Dominican Republic, we take control of their finances, for they're in debt to Europe, and their economy is about to crumble, so we step in. We certainly start a precedent there that we continue all the way up until today. And then in Cuba, guys, we're going to spend a little bit more time on this, but you should know that we get involved, there's a massive rebellion there, and we send 5,000 troops to govern and to take over for 28 months. And so I want you guys to reflect on this political cartoon with Teddy and his big stick. Look carefully at the cartoon, and please describe what you see and how Teddy is portrayed. Alright, so let's move on to the growth of imperialism. So there's 4 main factors, and so guys, your ticket to leave tomorrow is to know all 4. So the first one is economic. And think about the Industrial Revolution. I have factories pictured there on the left. And so there's a huge increase in industry worldwide. And there's really no one country that has all of the resources to run their factories. And so by the late 1800s, most industrialized nations had placed high tariffs against each other. All right, guys, to reflect, please put down, why do tariffs help or hurt the economy? So put down what you guys think the role of tariffs are for a country's economy. And then look at the picture on the right. It shows a huge container ship that's, sending its goods abroad. And so this is what happens back then, guys, is industrialized countries, build up these walls of tariffs, and they need other countries to sell their goods to, new markets. And so this expansion overseas becomes known as new imperialism. And so let's move on to the second factor in the growth of imperialism, is nationalism. And I have here a political cartoon entitled Europe Leads the Way. So another reflection I need you guys to do is, how is England's empire portrayed here? Alright, so after you guys do that, let's look at what I mean by nationalism. So here we're really seeing competition among countries. So the countries in Western Europe had begun to invest in industries in nations in Africa and Asia. And so you want to protect your investments. And so how do you do that? You need to exert control over these territories that you're trying to trade with. So some, as you know, became colonies. Others became protectorates. And that's a territory where the European country allows them to have their own ruler. And in exchange, the local ruler usually had to accept advice, mostly economic and sometimes political, from the mother country, from Europe. And so what I did here on the bottom, guys, is I want you to know that this is like a game. And the U.S. notices what's going on in the world, and we try to join in the race. Okay, guys, the third factor in the growth of imperialism is military advances, most notably in technology. For remember, we had just done our unit on the Gilded Age, and we know about all of the steel and oil and coal that is being efficiently produced in our country. And so we really channel that into forming one of the greatest navies in the world. And so how do we justify that? Well, remember, we are developing our interest overseas with business, and so the support for building a large navy grows. The U.S. sees that, this is a race. They need to acquire bases overseas before the Europeans, shut us out from these new foreign markets. Pictured here, guys, is the USS Maine, one of our famous battleships, and it's going to play an important role in this new era for us. An important factor in our growth in the Navy, guys, comes from an important book. The title is The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. I have pictured here the author, Admiral Alfred T. Mann. He was a professor at the Naval War College, and he pointed out that prosperous nations such as the Dutch and the British had large fleets of merchant ships, to trade. And so they needed a navy to protect these ships and to defend the country's rights to trade with other countries. And I have pictured here, it's restored obviously today, but this would be an example of a merchant ship that the British used for their famous tea company in India. Alright, guys, the last factor in the growth of imperialism is humanitarian, and this is what really gets me going, so I'll try to remain calm. But the two theories, pictured on the right is social Darwinism, and pictured on the left is Anglo-Saxonism. So social Darwinism argues that nations do compete with each other, just like in survival of the fittest that you guys learn about in biology. And here it's taken to the human level, and it's seen as, only the strongest survive, and that there's a reason for their superiority. And look at how they match the African American with the chimpanzee brain. But this is what we use to justify our superiority abroad with other cultures. And we even, of course, use this at home, like we just learned about in the Progressive era. And this is a horrible picture, but I did include it for a reason. It's taken in Australia during the time when they were settling and rounding up the native population. So Anglo-Saxonism certainly makes the whites look superior and the natives, the aborigines, look like animals. So let's get into some more of these theories. So part of this comes from an author known as John Fiske, pictured here on the right. He argued that English-speaking nations had superior culture and systems of government. So this was known as Anglo-Saxonism, and it linked with manifest destiny, which we learned about in US 1. Remember, this was our divine belief that we were to expand westward, and we know we crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains and faced the frontier. And now that the frontier was closed, our destiny was to just spread our ideas abroad and to expand our civilization among the lesser people. And a minister of the time, Josiah Strong, linked Anglo-Saxonism to the Christian missionary movement. One of his famous quotes is that he believed we were, quote, divinely commissioned to be our brother's keeper. And so that quote certainly is represented in this horrible picture. And so this Christian belief in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race really motivates missionaries to join the American businesses overseas. And so the next screencast is going to be about Hawaii, where we do have both business and missionaries and a native population. And though Hawaii is a beautiful paradise, many people don't know about the tragedy that the native population faced over 100 years ago. So guys, my last reflection question for you is, what do you think is going to happen in these new countries where we are seeking trade, sending missionaries, and trying to exert our influence through political and economic domination? Please give me some predictions there on your guided notes, and we'll talk about these in your groups tomorrow. Good night, and this is Mrs. Tevis-Finn signing off.